It was the kind of night when the rain never seemed to stop. Thick, cold sheets of it swept across the empty streets, hissing against the cracked pavement of the industrial district. The air smelled faintly of rust and oil, and the distant hum of the river blended with the occasional groan of old steel beams shifting in the wind. At the far end of Riverford's shipping yard stood the Mercer warehouse, a hulking, gray structure that had seen better decades. Inside, only one man was on duty. Daniel Hargrove had worked this job for years, and on most nights the place was his to command, a routine patrol. A quiet building, hours marked only by the sound of his boots on concrete, but that night something felt different. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed heavier in the far corners, or how the echo of his own footsteps returned a beat too late. No one else was supposed to be there, yet Daniel found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than usual. The clock on the break room wall read 1:07 a.m. outside. The rain struck the corrugated roof in a steady, relentless rhythm. He took a sip from his coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, and set the cup down. The security cameras showed nothing unusual: empty hallways, rows of stacked crates, the silent forklift parked under the flickering light in the Lodi. NG Bay at 1:15, Daniel's keyring jingled as he unlocked the door to the east wing. The corridor beyond was colder, darker. He stepped inside, flashlight beams slicing through the gloom. Somewhere deep in the warehouse, a faint metallic clang rang out, too distant to place. He paused, listening, the sound of the rain above now barely reaching him. That was the last moment anyone saw him alive. Minutes turned into hours before the absence was noticed. His radio lay silent on the desk. The east wing door stood ajar, rain blowing in through a cracked window. And for 25 years, no one would know where Daniel went, or why the echo of that metallic clang still seemed to linger in people's memories. Before the night of his disappearance, Daniel Hargrove's life could be summed up in quiet rhythms and steady habits. He lived in a small, two-story house on the edge of town, the kind with peeling paint on the porch rail and a mailbox that leaned slightly to one side. His elderly mother, Margaret, occupied the downstairs room, and Daniel had arranged his work schedule so he could be home during the day to help her. He fixed her tea just the way she liked it, strong with a dash of milk, and read aloud from the local paper when her eyesight tired. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or loud company. His friends, few but loyal, knew him as the type who preferred the corner table at the dockside diner, always ordering the same meal: grilled cheese, tomato soup, and a black coffee. He had an old pickup that he kept in immaculate condition, the kind of care that suggested it was more than just a vehicle, it was a companion on the empty drives he liked to take on Sunday afternoons. Woodworking was his one indulgence. In the garage, he'd sand and carve small pieces of oak into delicate figurines, birds mostly. He gifted them quietly without fanfare. A neighbor once recalled receiving a small sparrow from him after her husband passed, saying, he didn't have to say anything, the carving was enough. In the weeks before that final shift, there were little moments that stood out only in hindsight. Daniel lingered a bit longer in the garage at night, sometimes standing perfectly still as if listening to something outside. He had started locking the front door even in the middle of the day, an unusual habit in a neighborhood where people still left their screen doors open. Margaret once overheard him on the phone speaking in a low, careful voice. When she asked, he smiled and said it was just a wrong number. Still, nothing in his daily routine suggested the kind of ending that was coming. He was at work on time, joked with the dock supervisor about the weather, and waved to the paperboy on his way to the warehouse. No one could have guessed that these simple gestures, the comfort of repetition, the predictability of a man's life, were, in fact, the final chapters. Before everything broke apart. It was subtle at first, the kind of changes you only notice when you're looking back, piecing together fragments that never made sense at the time. Daniel had always been reserved, but lately his quiet seemed heavier, as if it was carrying something it couldn't put down. A week before his disappearance, his co-worker, Jim Carter, mentioned seeing him standing in the East Wing long after his patrol was over, staring at one of the loading bay walls. When Jim asked what he was doing, Daniel gave a vague smile and said, "Just listening." Then he walked away without another word. Margaret noticed it too. He began keeping a small notepad in his pocket, jotting down quick lines and then tearing the page out before anyone could see. Sometimes she would hear him in the kitchen late at night, talking softly, not in a way that suggested a phone call, but as if answering someone who was sent there. 3 days before that final shift, Daniel stopped by the local hardware store. The clerk, a young man named Tyler Briggs, remembered the visit clearly. Daniel bought an industrial-grade padlock and a heavy flashlight, the kind used by rescue crews. Tyler joked that it looked like he was preparing for a storm. Daniel just said, "Something like that," and left without making eye contact. Then there was the remark to his friend Lisa Morin at the Dockside Diner. She'd asked if he'd be joining their usual Friday night card game. He shook his head, slid a $5 bill under his coffee cup and told her, "I've got a few things I need to take care of before it gets worse." Lisa didn't ask what it was. At the time, it sounded like he was talking about his mother's health or maybe just the leaking roof at home. But after he vanished, those words would come back to haunt her, along with the small detail she hadn't thought to mention to the police right away: how, just before he left, Daniel had reached into his coat pocket. ND briefly touched something wrapped in brown paper, like a man reassuring himself it was still there. She never saw what it was. And maybe, she admitted years later, she didn't want to. The night Daniel disappeared began like any other late shift. The rain had been falling since dusk, pooling in the cracked asphalt outside the loading bays. Inside, the air was damp and cool, smelling faintly of sawdust and old engine oil. Daniel clocked in at exactly 11:00 p.m. Hung his coat on the back of the security office chair and poured himself a cup of coffee from the half-empty pot. At 12:45, he made his first round of the warehouse. The cameras caught him moving through the main hall, flashlight in hand, pausing briefly to check the locks on the west entrance. Everything seemed normal. At 1:07, he was back in the break room, flipping through a week-old newspaper while the rain hammered the roof in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Then, at 1:15, he stood, clipped his radio to his belt and left the break room without saying a word. The East Wing corridor stretched long and dark before him, the hum of the overhead lights uneven, flickering every few seconds. He pushed the heavy door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The East Wing was different from the rest of the warehouse, colder, quieter. Rows of crates loomed like dark silhouettes, their labels faded with age. Somewhere in the distance, metal clanged against metal, the sound sharp enough to make him stop. His flashlight beam swept over pallets and rusting machinery, but nothing moved. A security camera near the far wall recorded him walking toward the sound. The light from his torch wavered, disappearing behind a row of tall shelving units. That was the last frame in which he appeared. By 1:32, the camera feed showed only the empty corridor, the beam of his flashlight lying on the floor like a dropped breadcrumb. When Jim Carter came in for his shift change at 3:00 a.m., the security office was empty. The radio sat on the desk, silent. The break room light was still on, Daniel's coffee cup half finished. The East Wing door was ajar, rain blowing in through a cracked window, and the floor bore faint, wet footprints that stopped abruptly halfway down the hall. Beyond that point there was nothing. The search began before sunrise, when the warehouse was still cloaked in the smell of damp concrete and cold metal. Jim Carter had called the police within minutes of finding the empty security office, his voice low but urgent, and by 4:00 a.m. 2 patrol cars were parked outside, red and blue lights flashing faintly through the rain. Officers moved quickly, sweeping through the building with flashlights that cut narrow beams through the darkness. They started with the East Wing, retracing Daniel's last known steps. His flashlight was collected as evidence, still functional, its lens smudged with a faint, greasy fingerprint. The footprints, those odd, wet prints that trailed halfway down the hall, were photographed, measured, and then followed until they simply stopped. No scuff marks, no sign of a struggle, just an abrupt end on smooth, dry concrete. Outside, a small search team fanned out into the surrounding yard. The rain had erased almost everything, but they combed the gravel lots, the loading docks, and the narrow strip of grass along the fence line. The riverbank was checked by two officers with high-powered lamps, their light rippling over the black water. Nothing. By mid-morning, the Riverford Fire Department had joined in, bringing a thermal imaging camera to scan the building for any sign of a person hiding or trapped inside. The readings came back clean. Volunteers arrived from town, some still in work clothes, others clutching umbrellas against the steady drizzle. Margaret, pale and trembling, sat inside a patrol car, clutching Daniel's old flannel jacket as if it could anchor her to something real. Rumors started almost immediately. Some whispered about a break-in gone wrong, others about an accident in one of the warehouse's disused storage pits. A few claimed Daniel had been seen arguing with someone in a dark sedan 2 nights earlier, though no one could say who the driver was. The search continued into the evening, with officers methodically checking every crate, every maintenance tunnel, every locked door. By the time they called it for the night, the only tangible evidence they had was the flashlight, the footprints, and a half-finished cup of coffee, sitting exactly where Daniel had left it. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into Daniel's disappearance seemed to move in slow circles. Each new tip felt promising at first, until it led nowhere. A truck driver came forward, claiming he'd seen a man matching Daniel's description walking along Route 7 just after dawn the morning he vanished. But when detectives pulled traffic camera footage from that stretch of road, the figure in the grainy frame turned out to be a drifter heading in the opposite direction. Another lead surfaced when a fisherman reported finding a scrap of flannel snagged on a branch near the river. Margaret held her breath as the police collected it, but forensic tests showed it was Daniel's. The news hit her like a second loss, the hope that had briefly flared up snuffed out in an instant. Inside the department, the case file grew thicker, full of statements and dead-end theories. Detective Alan Price admitted to a local reporter that the lack of physical evidence was like chasing a shadow. The security footage gave them a clear starting point, but nothing after that made sense. The footprints that stopped halfway down the East Wing hall remained one of the most baffling details. It was as if Daniel had stepped into thin air. By the 1-year mark, the search effort had dwindled. The warehouse had been swept multiple times, its walls tapped for hidden spaces, its floors scanned with ground-penetrating radar. Nothing unusual was found. Volunteers stopped showing up. The flyers, once taped to shop windows and telephone poles, were faded and curling at the edges, ignored by people who passed them every day. For Margaret, the quiet was the worst part. The phone stopped ringing, the visits from friends became less frequent. Each evening she still left the porch light on, a small beacon against the darkness, though she couldn't have said whether it was for Daniel or for herself. By the second anniversary, the Riverford police officially reclassified the case as inactive. It wasn't closed, they insisted, just waiting for something new to surface. But in a town where memories were short and the world kept moving, Daniel's name began to fade from casual conversation. Only in certain corners, in whispers between people who still remembered that night, did the story linger, more mystery than memory, more question than answer. It was 25 years later when the first real lead emerged, by accident. The Mercer warehouse had long been abandoned, its windows boarded, its roof sagging in places. In the summer of 2019, a property developer named Richard Keene purchased the site, hoping to renovate it into storage units. On a humid August afternoon, he brought in a small crew to assess the building. They started in the East Wing, where the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The floorboards in that section had warped badly over the years, and as Richard walked toward the far wall, his boot struck a spot that gave a hollow Unfamiliar sound. He stopped, frowned, and tapped it again, definitely hollow. One of the workers, a wiry man named Jorge Alvarez, fetched a crowbar. When they pried up the first board, a draft of cool, stale air rose from below. The opening revealed a narrow gap too small to be part of the known maintenance tunnels and not marked on any of the old blueprints Richard had been given. Curiosity overrode caution. They widened the hole until a staircase came into view, steep and lined with rusted metal rails. Richard leaned over the opening, his flashlight beam disappearing into the darkness. The light caught on something, an edge of concrete, the corner of a crate, and then slipped deeper into blackness. He didn't say it aloud, but something about the air down there felt wrong. It wasn't just musty, it carried a faint, acrid scent like oil mixed with something older, almost metallic. Jorge suggested they wait until the next day, bring proper safety gear, but Richard insisted on taking a quick look. He descended halfway before the beam of his flashlight landed on the strangest thing, a small wooden carving of a bird resting on the bottom step. Its wings smoothed by handling, it was out of place, impossibly so. And when Richard picked it up, he noticed a faint set of initials carved into the underside, DH. By that evening, word had spread to the Riverford Police Department. Detectives arrived with evidence bags and floodlights, sealing off the warehouse once again. For the first time in decades, Daniel Hargrove's name was spoken not as a mystery from the past, but as the center of an active investigation. The investigation moved quickly once the hidden staircase was uncovered. On the morning of August 14th, the Riverford police brought in a forensic team, their heavy boots thudding against the warped warehouse floor. Powerful floodlights turned the dim east wing into a harsh, white glare as officers in protective suits descended into the opening. The staircase led to a small concrete chamber, no more than 12 feet across, its walls slick with condensation. The air was heavy and cold, carrying that same metallic tang Richard Keene had noticed. In the corner, an old wooden crate sat half-collapsed, its contents spilling onto the damp floor, a thermos, a folded security uniform, and a pair of work boots coated in dust. Inside one boot, wrapped in brittle brown paper, was a small notebook bound with string. Detective Alan Price, now older and grayer but still on the force, untied the string with gloved hands. The pages were warped from moisture, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Daniel Hargrove, S. Most of the entries were short, written in quick, uneven lines. Heard it again tonight. Don't go past the third row, it's still moving. On the last page, the words were scratched deeper into the paper, as if written in haste. If I don't make it out, it's in the floor, don't open it. But the most chilling detail wasn't in the notebook. It was on the far wall of the chamber, where faint, jagged letters had been carved directly into the concrete. The floodlight caught them just right, revealing a message: they found me. Forensic teams photographed everything, collecting fibers, dust samples, and fragments from the crate. No human remains were discovered, but there were odd markings on the floor, parallel scratches in the concrete, as though something heavy had been dragged toward the center of the room and lowered through a space that no longer existed. Theories exploded overnight. Some speculated that the basement had been used decades earlier by a smuggling ring. Others whispered about tunnels under the warehouse leading to the river, but for the first time since 1994, the mystery had a pulse again. The evidence was real, tangible, and it told a story, just not one anyone was ready to hear in full. 2 days later, the warehouse was sealed off under round-the-clock guard. A chain-link fence went up almost overnight and the public was warned to stay away. Still, word spread fast through Riverford. By evening, small clusters of locals gathered across the street, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what police might be hauling out. It was just after sunset when Linda Marlowe, a retired librarian who'd lived 3 blocks from the warehouse her whole life, came forward with something. And she said she had kept quiet for too long. She carried a manila envelope worn at the corners and insisted on speaking to Detective Price directly. Inside were photographs, grainy, washed in the yellow tint of a disposable camera. The dates printed on the edges placed them in the spring of 1994, the same year Daniel vanished. One image showed the side of the warehouse before its renovations. A heavy, rusted hatch was visible low to the ground, partially hidden by stacked pallets. Another showed a man in a dark jacket standing near that hatch. His back was turned, but the build, the posture, it could have been Daniel. Or it could have been someone else entirely. Linda claimed she had taken the photos on her way home from the market, after hearing a loud metallic clang inside the building. She never told anyone because, as she put it, you didn't ask questions back then if you wanted a quiet life. Detective Price had the photos scanned and enhanced, but the man's face remained obscured in shadow. Still, the discovery of the hatch in those old images reignited the search. The next morning, crews began removing floor panels in the east wing, hunting for any sealed entry points that matched the photo. By mid-afternoon, they found it beneath layers of rotted wood and hardened dust, a square steel hatch welded shut from the outside. When they struck it with a mallet, the sound echoed deeper than the space should have allowed, like there was an empty void beneath. The air that seeped up through the thin gaps was cold, carrying a faint, damp odor that no one could place. Detective Price ordered the area cleared. The decision was made to cut the welds in the morning, under controlled conditions. But as the team packed up for the night, one of the younger officers swore he heard a low scraping noise from beneath the hatch, followed by something. That could have been a whisper, or just the wind forcing its way through the seams. The morning broke gray and heavy, clouds pressing low as if the sky itself wanted to keep what was buried from being uncovered. The crew gathered around the hatch, their breath fogging in the chilled air. Detective Price stood back, arms folded, while a welder in a flameproof mask lowered his torch to the seams. The hiss of heat against metal cut through the stillness, and every so often sparks jumped like fireflies in reverse, falling into the gloom of the R. When the final weld gave way, there was a deep metallic groan, and the hatch shifted slightly, releasing a stale rush of air that smelled of rust, damn. Earth and something faintly organic, something old. Price motioned for the portable lights to be brought in. As the beam pierced the opening, it revealed a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The metal rungs were coated in dust, except for a few where the grime seemed smudged, as if touched more recently than it should have been. Officer Marquez volunteered to go down first, camera strapped to his chest. His boots clanged softly as he descended, the sound growing muffled the deeper he went. When he reached the bottom, his voice crackled over the radio. "It's a tunnel, concrete walls maybe 6 feet across, goes in both directions." He paused, one side's blocked by a cave-in. "The other, I think there's a door." The team followed one by one, their footsteps echoing like hollow heartbeats. The door Marquez had seen was steel, scratched and dented, with an old padlock dangling open as if waiting for them. Price gave a slow nod and Marquez pushed it in. Inside was a small chamber, low ceiling, walls sweating with moisture. Against the far wall sat a wooden chair, and on it an old tape recorder. Beside it, a neatly folded jacket, the style matching one Daniel had been photographed wearing in 1994. The air was so cold that everyone's breath mingled in a faint fog around their faces. Price crouched, gloved hands steady as he pressed the recorder's play button, at first only static. Then a man's voice, hoarse, urgent, filled the room. "If you found this, I don't know how much time I have. They're still here, not people, not anymore." The recording ended with a sharp metallic scrape, followed by something that could have been a distant, guttural exhale. The team froze, listening. In the heavy silence that followed, a soft thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, once, twice closer. Price ordered the team to pull back, his voice low but urgent. No one argued. They moved quickly, their flashlights jittering against the damp walls, the sound of their own breathing now louder than their footsteps. Behind them, the faint thuds seemed to follow, slow, deliberate, until they reached the ladder and scrambled up into the open air. Once outside, the hatch was sealed again, heavy bolts driven into place as if trying to hold something in rather than keep anyone out. The evidence was logged, the tape recorder bagged, but the jacket price kept glancing at it, as though the fabric itself might whisper the rest of E's story if he stared long enough. In the official report, nothing was written about the sounds in the tunnel. Nothing about the sudden drop in temperature or the strange metallic tang in the air, but those who were there knew what they'd heard. And none of them would ever walk past that part of the forest without feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against their back. Maybe the truth will come out someday, maybe it's buried too deep for anyone to dig up without paying a price, but what do you think? Was it just the echo of an old story, or did something survive down there, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close? If you have a theory, leave it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, real cases, strange endings, unanswered questions, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a mystery, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.